War is the mother of invention, and the graveyard of the obsolete. In 1941, the Pacific Ocean was the largest battlefield in human history, and the United States Navy tried to hold it with biplanes and flying barrels. We sent boys out in machines that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, and couldn't run. But the American philosophy of war is simple. If you can't outfly them, outproduce them. If you can't outturn them, out-armor them. This isn't just a list of planes. This is the story of an industrial evolution written in blood. We are going to track the DNA of the U.S. Navy fighter. We will see the flying coffin that doomed the defenders of Midway. We will break down the ugly little workhorse that taught the Navy how to kill. And we will reveal the monster, the Ensign Eliminator, a plane so dangerous the Navy banned it from carriers, only for the Marines to turn it into the deadliest weapon in the Pacific. From the desperate defense of Wake Island to the turkey shoot over the Marianas, from the weakest to the strongest. This is every single U.S. Navy fighter of World War II, ranked by their impact on history. In the early days of the Pacific War, the math was terrifyingly simple. If you were an American pilot and you saw a Japanese Zero in your rearview mirror, you were already dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built a sword. Fast, agile, and lethal. The U.S. Navy had built a target. Exhibit A. The Brewster F4F Buffalo. On paper, it looked modern. Monoplane, retractable gear. But in the air, it was a crime against aerodynamics. The Buffalo was heavy. It was unstable. But the real killer was the weight. Engineers kept adding radio gear and armor plate until the plane was so overweight the landing gear would sometimes collapse just sitting on the deck. At the Battle of Midway, the Marine Corps sent 26 Buffaloes to intercept the Japanese strike force. It wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution. The Zeros swarmed them. The Buffalo pilots couldn't turn, couldn't run, and their guns jammed under G-forces. 13 pilots died in minutes. One survivor, Captain Philip White, climbed out of his wrecked machine and reportedly said, "Any commander who orders a pilot into a Buffalo should be court-martialed as a traitor." The Buffalo didn't just fail. It vanished. It was quickly relegated to training duties, a tragic footnote of hubris. But the Navy had a backup plan. Another tubby, ugly little plane. It looked just as clumsy as the Buffalo. But this one had a secret. It was made of Grumman iron. Enter the F4F Wildcat. If the Zero was a katana, the Wildcat was a sledgehammer. It wasn't fast. It wasn't agile. An F4F pilot who tried to dogfight a Zero was committing suicide. The Japanese plane could turn inside the Wildcat's radius 3 times over. But the Wildcat had 2 things the Japanese didn't: armor plate behind the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese planes prioritized speed above all. 1 incendiary round to the fuel tank, and the pilot burned. But you could punch holes in a Wildcat all day. The rubber lining in the tanks would swell shut, stopping the leak. The pilot would wipe the sweat off his brow and keep flying. Since they couldn't outturn the enemy, they had to outthink them. Enter Lieutenant Commander John Thach. He realized that 1 Wildcat was prey, but 2 Wildcats were a trap. He invented the Thach Weave. When a Zero got on a Wildcat's tail, the American wingman would cut across, dragging the enemy into a head-on collision with 6 .50 caliber machine guns. It wasn't pretty fighting. It was a bar brawl. The Wildcat held the line at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal. It was the only thing standing between the Japanese fleet and the west coast of America. It was ugly. It was slow, but it refused to die. The Wildcat saved the Navy. But saving the Navy wasn't enough. We needed to crush the enemy. The pilots were asking for more power. They wanted a machine that didn't just survive the zero, but hunted it. Grumman listened, and what they built next wasn't a fighter, it was an exterminator. By 1943, the David versus Goliath story was over. The United States stopped trying to be clever. We simply decided to drown the Japanese Empire in aluminum and horsepower. The desperation of the Wildcat was gone. It was replaced by the most efficient killing machine in naval history. The Grumman F6F Hellcat wasn't a revolution, it was an evolution. Grumman essentially asked the pilots, "What do you hate about the Wildcat?" The pilots said, "It's too slow, it can't climb." So Grumman took the Wildcat design, pumped it full of steroids, and bolted on the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. 2,000 horsepower, 212 pounds of armor plating, 6 50 caliber machine guns. The result was a plane that didn't need to weave. It could climb with a zero. It could dive away from a zero. And if it got hit, it shrugged it off. The Hellcat was easy to fly. It was forgiving. It made average farm boys into aces. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat proved that the war had changed. Japanese pilots, now poorly trained and desperate, flew into a wall of American steel. We call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Hellcats swatted nearly 300 Japanese planes out of the sky. The Hellcat wasn't flashy. It didn't look like a sports car. It looked like a lunchbox. But it was the deadliest lunchbox ever built. By the end of the war, the F6F Hellcat claimed 5,163 kills. Its kill ratio was 19-1. For every one Hellcat lost, 19 Japanese planes went into the water. It didn't just win the air war, it deleted the opposition. But wait. The Navy had a problem. We were building massive fleet carriers for the Hellcats, but we were also building hundreds of tiny jeep carriers to hunt U-boats. The Hellcat was too big and too fast for these little floating runways. So, the Navy did something strange. They went back to the Wildcat. General Motors took the old F4F design, stripped the weight, and added a new engine. They called it the FM2, the Wilder Wildcat. While the Hellcats were taking all the glory in the big battles, the FM2s were doing the dirty work in the mud. They flew off decks the size of tennis courts. And off the coast of Samar, when the massive Japanese battleship Yamato surprised the U.S. fleet, it was these tiny FM2s that buzzed the giant ships, strafing battleships with machine guns to distract them. They were the scrappy street fighters of the late war, outclassed but never outgunned. The Hellcat was the hero. The FM2 was the brawler. But there was a third faction of pilots, the ones who didn't want a forgiving plane. They wanted speed. They wanted raw kinetic energy. They looked at the Hellcat and said, "Too slow." They looked at a new prototype from Vought, with a nose so long you couldn't see the runway and wings bent like a bird of prey. The Navy said it was unflyable. The Marines said, "We'll take it." If the Hellcat was a golden retriever, loyal, reliable, friendly, then this next machine was a pit bull that had been starved for a week. By 1943, the Navy had the Hellcat. They were winning. But the engineers at Vought weren't interested in winning. They wanted dominance. They took the same massive 2,000 horsepower engine as the Hellcat, but they wrapped it in the sleekest, most aerodynamic fuselage ever designed. The result was the Vought F4U Corsair. It was a stroke of genius. It was the first American fighter to crack 400 miles per hour. But there was a catch. To balance the fuel tanks, they pushed the cockpit way back. When a pilot sat in a Corsair, he was staring at 14 feet of engine nose. On a carrier approach, with the nose pitched up, he was blind. He couldn't see the deck. He couldn't see the landing officer. The Navy looked at the carnage and said, "No thanks." In 1943, the Navy banned the Corsair from carrier duty. They dumped the entire production run onto the U.S. Marines. The Navy thought they were giving the Marines their garbage. They were actually handing them Excalibur. The Marines didn't care about landing on boats. They operated from dirt strips on islands. And once the Corsair got into the air, the ensign eliminator transformed. The Japanese called it whistling death because of the sound the air made rushing through its wing root radiators. The Corsair was faster than the Zero. It could outclimb the Zero, and unlike the Hellcat, which was a jack of all trades, the Corsair was a master of energy fighting. Marine pilots like Pappy Boyington and the Black Sheep Squadron turned the Solomon Islands into a graveyard for Japanese aviation. They didn't dogfight, they slashed. They used the Corsair's speed to dictate the terms of engagement. Dive, kill, climb, repeat. By late 1944, the threat had changed. The Japanese weren't dogfighting anymore. They were becoming human missiles. The Navy realized the Hellcat was too slow to intercept the kamikazes. They needed speed. They swallowed their pride and brought the Corsair back to the carriers. The ensign eliminator had become the fleet's savior. But even the Corsair was a creature of the internal combustion engine. It drank gas. It spun a propeller. And while the U.S. Navy was perfecting the propeller, the laws of physics were about to change. By 1945, the war was won. The Imperial Navy was at the bottom of the ocean. But the U.S. Navy wasn't looking at Japan anymore. They were looking at physics. They knew the age of the propeller was dying. But the early jet engines were too slow to take off from carriers. So, in a moment of technological panic, they built two machines. One was the ultimate expression of the old world. The other was a mutant. Grumman looked at the Hellcat, the industrial god, and decided it was too fat. They took that same massive 2,000 horsepower engine and bolted it to the smallest, lightest airframe that could physically hold it. They called it the F8F Bearcat. This wasn't a soldier. It was a hot rod. It was designed for one purpose: to sit on a carrier deck, wait for a kamikaze radar blip, and scramble to intercept it before it hit the fleet. The Bearcat was the pinnacle of piston engine engineering. It was the perfect dogfighter. But it was a ghost. The first squadrons arrived in the Pacific in August 1945. Before they could fire a shot in anger, the bombs fell on Hiroshima. The Bearcat was the sharpest sword ever made for a war that was already over. And then there was the freak show. The Navy wanted jets, but early jets had terrible throttle response. So Ryan Aeronautical built a Centaur, the FR-1 Fireball. In the front, a standard piston engine. In the back, a General Electric jet engine. It was brilliant. It was weird, and it was instantly obsolete. The Fireball was a bridge between two worlds, a technological dead end that proved just how desperate the Navy was to conquer the future. In 4 short years, the U.S. Navy went from the tragedy of the Buffalo to the supremacy of the Bearcat. They started the war with flying coffins that couldn't turn. They ended it with machines that defied gravity. It cost thousands of lives. It cost billions of dollars. But it proved the thesis. War is the mother of invention. And the U.S. Navy fighter was its favorite child. Now, I have a question for you. It's 1944. You are a fresh pilot standing on the deck of the USS Essex. To your left is the Hellcat. It's ugly, it's slow, but it guarantees you'll come home alive. To your right is the Corsair. It's a widowmaker. It's hard to fly, but if you master it, you are the king of the sky. Which cockpit do you climb into? The survivor or the legend? Let me know in the comments below.